Hey everybody, what's up? I'm Bianca.
And I'm Kiana.
And we're the Brigid Kemmerer twins. Welcome back to our YouTube channel. So for today's video, we have a very exciting two guests joining us. So we are going to be doing a live discussion with the author of our B&C Book Club November/October book club pick, Letters to the Lost, with a special guest, which is our best friend, one of our best friends, Sophia. We have known her for like 10 years. We all love to read together. We pick one book and then we read at the same time. We love to talk about it. So it was perfect that we got to read this book together, and we're going to be talking with Brigid together. So I am so excited.
So we are here with a very special guest. Well, two very special guests. I'm so excited to be talking about this book. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I literally binged this book like in a couple days, and I reread it, and it's just so good. It gives me all the feels. And I'm here with one of my best friends, Sophia. We buddy read this together, so we have a lot of opinions. So do you want to go first?
Sure. So you have written a lot of contemporary and fantasy books. So how different was writing Letters to the Lost versus like a fantasy book?
So, it's really funny to me, all of my books at their core are about the character. I love characters. I love torturing my characters. It makes me sound like a psychopath. I like putting them in really challenging situations. So when it comes to doing fantasy versus contemporary, it's really, if I take my fantasies and strip away all the magic and fantasy stuff, it's really just a contemporary, and the same with my contemporaries. The biggest challenge, I would say, like with a contemporary, you kind of have to follow the rules of the world. Like, you can't have a 15-year-old girl walking through the woods at 2:00 in the morning unless something is really wrong, right? Mm-hmm. But in fantasy, it's totally okay. You could, go for a stroll, 2:00, it's fine. But in fantasy, like, you need to explain a lot of things. Like with contemporary, everyone knows what an oven is. In fantasy, you need to build that world around it. So for me, it's just always the world I'm operating in.
So I want to ask, because there's a lot of characters in this book, who was your favorite character to write for and why?
Oh, wow. So it alternates, point of view between Declan and Juliet. And I identified with both of them a lot. But I have to say, Declan might have been the easiest one to write through because he was just very angry. He was carrying a lot of emotion and he was not afraid to share it. Juliet was a little bit more reserved and was trying to keep it hidden. Whereas with Declan, I could just throw it out there on the page.
Now, who's your least favorite character to write?
Oh, wow. Probably Declan's mom.
Oh.
Because, as a mom, like, she made so many mistakes. And as a mom, I'm just like, he just needs a hug. Like, can we just comfort him? So Declan's mom, probably.
Me and Sophia were just talking about this because, honestly, my least favorite character was Alan. I hated Alan. And I was like, that has to be her answer for this.
But that's interesting, Declan's mom.
So Alan is definitely, I wouldn't say he's a villain. He's kind of in an impossible situation where, he wants to support his wife and he's a step parent and he doesn't, and Declan probably isn't the easiest kid to get along with. And he didn't know the whole story in the beginning. He didn't know everything Declan was going through. And, I don't know. I really like writing complex people. So yes, even though Alan was kind of a jerk, I didn't hate writing his character.
So in the story, Julia finds out about Declan being in the dark towards the end of the book. How did you decide who figured it out first and why?
So, it's really funny. I got to the scene where they're, kind of on the side of the road, and I knew I was going to have to make a choice. Like, one of them was going to need to figure it out. Mm-hmm. And I felt like it would make it a little bit more complex if Declan was the one to figure it out right then, as opposed to Juliet. And I just kind of carried it from there, and I liked where it went.
I really love that choice too. Juliet, there were so many moments where I was just like, it's totally obvious, it's him.
Obvious.
I was like, oh.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think because they have a conversation about that where Declan's like, look, do you level with me? Do you want me to just tell you who I am? And I wanted her to kind of make a conscious choice. Like, you know what? No, I don't want to know.
when Juliet found out that Declan was the dark, and they're just like, we were in denial the whole time. And I was like, I mean, really, you guys were in denial like the entire time, but it's fine.
So what was your favorite scene to write?
You know, it probably is that scene where they're on the side of the road sitting in the car, and it's like the first moment of vulnerability from both of them. You know, that's probably one of my favorite scenes in the whole book. I really liked it.
I loved it.
One of my other favorite scenes was the ending. I love the ending.
Oh, yay!
There's a lot of notes between the dark and Cemetery Girls. So what was your favorite note to write for?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. I would have to say, so I really like the very first letter that the book actually opens with. When I decided that I was going to write this book, you know, I knew that I wanted Juliet's mom to be, you know, this world traveling photojournalist. And I had asked some writer friends, like, does anybody know a photojournalist? And one of my writer friends said, oh, my brother was actually, you know, a photojournalist during Desert Storm. You should really talk to him. And he started sending me article after article and, you know, telling me all these different stories. And he said, oh, here's a photograph that's really powerful. And this is kind of an image of that, you know, the kind of thing that we encountered in the field. And it was the photo that Juliet is talking about that the book opens with, where, you know, she says there's the, you know, the girl in the flowered dress and there's the speckles of blood and the gun and things like that. And that, as soon as I saw that photograph, it just blew me away. And I knew I had to describe that photograph in that opening letter. Because it was just so powerful. All the photographs in the book are all based off of real photos that really exist, with the exception of the famous one that Juliet's mom took, because I didn't want to take a real photo and assign it to a fictional character. But as far as like the real messages between the two of them, I love the message where Juliet gets his letter where he's like, I set up an email address, your move. And she runs and she leaves the cemetery and goes to send him an email. Because it was just such a pivotal moment for all of them.
I remember me and Sophia were reading it around the exact same time. So when we both got to that part, we were texting each other like, okay, game on. They're about to find out. Like, come on, get to it. But talking about the photos for a bit, Sophia and I were talking last night about how the mom was a big part of Juliet wanting to become a photographer and why she didn't want to. So Sophia, I know you had a couple questions about the mom, so I'll let you go ahead and ask them.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what was your idea behind giving Juliet's mom the profession of being a photographer of all things?
So, you know, when I started writing, I knew that I wanted Juliet and Declan to kind of meet in the way that they did through, you know, exchanging letters. And I knew that her mom was going to, you know, be dead, and that Juliet was going to be coping by writing letters at the cemetery. And I went back and forth through a lot of different professions. And I wanted it to be something, you know, that I hadn't really seen in any YA novels. I wanted it to be something, you know, that was big enough that Juliet would be like, wow, my mom is really an amazing person, but also not something, you know, that felt really cliched or too common. And then that's really why I settled on the, you know, basically war zone photography.
So a big part of like towards the end of the book is Juliet, spoiler alert for anyone watching, is Juliet going to develop the pictures and finding the pictures of her mom with another person. Now, was that like when you first thought of the book, was that like a point you wanted to get to, or was that as you were writing, like that came like you're like, wow, this would actually be like very like shocking to people and to Juliet, or was it something you always like thought about when you were writing like the beginning stages of the book?
No, that twist was in there from the very beginning. Like I knew that Juliet was going to find that. And I love, you know, when I write YA, I know something that's very common for authors is to get parents just out of the picture, which is totally okay, you know. But I tend to think of parents and grownups kind of always being along for the ride, right? You know, I mean, I'm in my 40s and I'm still dealing with my mother, and my husband's still dealing with his mother. So, you know, I like to really show parents in the spotlight. And one of the things that I like to show is that parents often make really poor choices And, you know, I think Juliet's mom made some poor choices. Does that make her a horrible person? I don't know. But just like Declan's mom makes some really horrible choices, and so does Alan. Declan's dad clearly makes some really poor choices. Yeah.
So this is actually a really interesting question. Were there any scenes or storylines that got cut from the first draft to the published version?
Nothing major. There is one scene in the book that my editor wanted to cut, and I fought to keep it. And that scene was, so Declan has kind of hit rock bottom. He thinks that maybe he was somehow involved with the car crash that took Juliet's mom's life. And he's had a fight with his best friend, Rev, you know, and Declan is in a really dark place. And he texts his friend and he's like, can I come over? I really need to talk to you. And of course his friend is like, absolutely, come over. So he goes over there and they have this big conversation where Rev kind of confides some things and Declan confides some things. And in the very first editorial letter, which is what my editor sends me, like with her first thoughts on the book, she said, you know, I wonder if we should cut this scene, you know, maybe build on the romance more. Maybe Declan should reach out to Juliet here. And I disagreed with her. It's one of my favorite scenes in the book. And it's also, you don't see a lot of alpha male boy characters being vulnerable with other alpha male boy characters in any kind of pop culture. So it was really important to me to kind of keep that moment. And I'm really glad that I did, because when I get emails from readers, they're always like, I love the relationship between, you know, Declan and Rev. I love their friendship. I love that they're so close, you know, even though they're both kind of, you know, guys.
Yeah, Declan and Rev, like their entire story, like it was
a rocky road. It was really rocky, but I love that their friendship is so strong. Ugh.
And it's definitely different, like you said, like a lot of young adult books that are like focused on the romance, they either just forget about like the parents or like the best friend of one of the main characters. But I love that you explored that and how they both have their own stuff going on and then they help each other. And that was that made me cry, that scene. I can't believe they wanted to cut it. I mean, I can't imagine the book without that scene, because that was kind of like their not forgiving moment, but that like they're like common ground.
Understanding,
that's a better word. So I was wondering, there's a lot of emotional scenes in the book. What was your like most difficult scene to write? Like emotionally, or like you didn't want to write it but you knew it had to be in the book, like whatever that works for it.
So probably, I'm trying to think. There were a couple of really emotional scenes. The one where Juliet is in the cemetery and she gets the call from her dad, and her dad is like, hey, you know, is it okay if I sell your mom's photography equipment? That was a really emotional scene for me to write. There also at the end, the scene between Declan and Alan, where they really kind of have this reckoning, that also for me, like to sit in that kind of headspace, it takes a lot of emotional energy to like really think about like what these characters are going through. And then also the scene where, you know, Juliet is just so upset. I feel like all of them, the whole book is emotional. Where Juliet is so upset and she, you know, runs to the cemetery and Declan finds her and he's like, no, you're okay. It's okay. And, you know, and she finally realizes who he is. Yeah.
I'm almost kind of glad that you waited till that moment where he was there to help her, like where she finally realized it.
Yeah.
Even though there were certain parts of the book where I was like, come on, it's so obvious.
It's right there.
But I'm glad like you had it be like an emotional scene rather than just like, what? You're him? Why? Like, oh, what? I like that you took it to more like an emotional place. That scene left me like on the edge of my seat. I was like, oh no. Yay. It was so good. So good.
So how long did it take for you to write this book?
So I started writing it, I'm trying to think. I remember vividly where and when I started writing it. And it was in April of 2014. And the first draft probably took me like 6 to 8 months. You know, and then I always do a couple rounds of revisions with my editor. This was the first, my Letters to the Lost was my 7th published book, but it was my first book with this editor at Bloomsbury. And I think that it just kind of launched a great relationship between me and my editor. She's amazing. But yeah.
Well, since we were talking about Declan and Rev's relationship, which friendship relationship, I really do love that because I mean, again, like you guys were saying, in a lot of the stories that you read, and I really did love that you put in the parents too, because parents are especially something that you never see in books. And so I really love that a lot. I was wondering, what was the idea when you're creating Rev and his story / backstory? Because that was pretty surprising when I read that.
So it's funny when I develop characters that sometimes characters just kind of come to me fully formed, and sometimes they take a lot of development along the way, and I need to figure out who they are and how they're going to interact. And for whatever reason, Rev just kind of leapt onto the page fully formed. And I was trying to think of who would be the best kind of friend for Declan, and I knew it would have to be someone who had a bit of a troubled past, somebody that Declan would be able to relate to in a really heavy way. And Rev just kind of came together all the way. And Rev does get his own book in More Than We Can Tell. And Rev's character took probably more research than any other character I have ever written, from both, the way that he loves Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I had never done, never knew anything about it. And I was like, oh, I've got this character who's like a black belt. I should probably take a class or talk to someone. And then also, I worked with psychologists, because I was like, so what would the mental effect be on someone who was severely abused as a child, who is then rescued out of that? I talked to several different Black women about like, what would it be like to adopt a white child and raise that child? Like how would that influence, you as a mother, versus how would that influence the child and how they're raised? How would that work? Like, what would that be like? It took a tremendous amount of research to kind of put his character on the page. And I love that so many readers relate to him and love his story and love his friendship with Declan, because it was so much fun and so fulfilling to write.
What has been your favorite book that you have written so far?
Oh, wow. So, it's funny. My favorite book is always like my newest book, just because it feels so fresh and like nobody knows about it. So I have to say my favorite one that I've written so far is Defy the Night, which is a fantasy that's coming out next fall. And I'm very, very excited about it.
So I'm excited to read that book.
I'm so excited.
And I'm curious, is it any different publishing a fantasy book rather than a contemporary? Like, what is it, the same steps or
same process?
Same process? Is there anything different?
It definitely has the same process, like from the writing and the editing and all those kinds of things. Fantasy does tend to cast a little bit of a wider net, whereas like YA contemporary, a lot of times kind of has a narrower reading audience, whereas YA fantasy, you'll get readers of all ages. You will get people who are like straight fantasy fans who are like, I don't read YA, but I read fantasy. It's the same. It doesn't matter. So YA fantasy tends to have really passionate fans, which is amazing. Whereas contemporary is just a little quieter. Like, I feel like I get more emails from teachers for contemporary than I do from readers. But as far as like writing the book and getting it published and all that is pretty much the same.
So I'm just curious, when you were writing Lives to the Lost, did you have like a certain mood board or a playlist for the characters, or who did you imagine for each of the main characters?
So I am never, ever good at like fan casting my characters. No one ever looks right. I always have a Spotify playlist, for my characters. There's a song by Imagine Dragons called Shots that I will always forever relate to Declan, because there's like a really slow piano acoustic version. Every time I listen to it, I'm like, oh, that's Declan's song. I don't do a lot of mood boards, but I love it when people send them to me, because it's so cool to see how, how my characters have affected readers. But yeah, for me, it's always the music.
So how do you deal with writer's block? Because that's actually something I'm very curious about. Like, how do you move forward when you're just really stuck?
I remind myself that I have to pay a mortgage. And no, I'm like, I need a paycheck. With writer's block, I feel like it tends to boil down to a couple different things. one big thing is fear. Like you start writing and you're like, I don't know where this is going. I think this is going to suck. This is going to be the worst thing I've ever written. I'm afraid to get it wrong. And I think, in school and growing up, we think, well, if I'm not going to do it right the first time, I shouldn't even do it at all. And with writing, you kind of have to throw all of that thinking away. And you have to allow yourself to be creative and to allow it to develop. The only thing you can't fix is a blank page, really. You kind of have to put it out there. And I frequently have these little conversations with myself where I'm like, I'm just going to write it. No one else has to read it. It's fine. I'm just going to put it on paper. It's fine. And when that is not the reason, sometimes if I am bored because I have lost track of the story, I need to backtrack a little bit. And that can be really hard. It can feel like you're throwing away work. If you say, oh, I've just written 5,000 words and the story is not going in the right direction, I need to delete them. That feels like a punch in the gut, but sometimes it's what needs to happen.
So this is not about Letters to the Lost, but I saw on an Instagram live or on an Instagram story that you rewrote, I think, A Curse So Dark and Lonely, 3 times. You said a couple different times. Mm-hmm. What makes you say, okay, you know what? I think I need to just scrap this and just start over.
So with A Curse So Dark and Lonely, that poor story. So that book, I had first started writing it in 2012 and I had written 50 pages, which is 10,000, 15,000 words. So not super long. And my publisher at the time wasn't interested in doing fantasy. So I kind of scrapped it for the time being. And then in 2016, I started thinking, okay, what is my next project going to be? And I pulled that out. My husband had sat me down and he was like, what do you feel really passionate about? What is the last thing that you wrote that was just fun to write? So I pulled out that manuscript from 2012 and I was like, oh, well, I am a much better writer now, 4 years later. Let me scrap this and start again. So I did. So I scrapped it and I started writing again. And I was writing in third person and I got about 25,000 words in. So 100 pages. And I said, this would be better in first person. I would like to tell the story better that way. But I had written 25,000 words. That takes a long time. And I was like, no, this is just too much work. It's going to take too much work. And I kept writing and I kept thinking, no, this would be better. This would be better. I wrote all the way up to 85,000 words, which is the entire length of Letters to the Lost. And I said, no, this would be better in first person. I need to do it. And I scrapped it. I scrapped it all and went back to the beginning. And I will say it's not as hard. For some, my husband was like, can't you just change all the pronouns? Isn't that all you need to do? No. But I did have the framework. I knew what was happening in the story. So that made it a little easier.
So I was thinking, I love Declan and Juliet's story. Now, I don't know, would there ever be a sequel? And if so, what would you want the sequel to be about?
I don't know. And I get requests for sequels all the time. I get, people are like, no, I want, I'm like, well, it does have a sequel and More Than We Can Tell. And people are like, no, I need a Declan and Juliet sequel. And then I'll also get requests, do a book for Matthew, who's a character introduced in More Than We Can Tell. I don't know. I like leaving their story kind of open-ended for, people to kind of interpret. And I'm worried, would they go to college and find other people? Would they break up? Would Declan go to college? I feel like Juliet would, but would Declan go to college? I don't know.
That kind of scares me. I'm okay with the ending now. I'm like, oh no.
Leave it there, they kissed, it's fine.
So I wanted to talk about why you wanted to become a writer. Were you a writer before? Have you always thought about writing? What was your moment, I want to be a writer?
I have always loved storytelling. The whole time I was growing up, I love stories. I love knowing what's happening. I would eavesdrop when my parents were talking, in the bedroom, to have a private conversation, not because I wanted gossip or anything like that. Just, I wanted to know what was going on. I love it. Anytime I come home, right? Anytime I come home from the grocery store, I'll start telling my husband about something that happens. And he's like, can you just give me the quick version, not the Brigid Kemmerer version? there's something about stories that I think is so relatable to all people. And I find people fascinating. I find the way people relate to each other fascinating. And I love being able to kind of put this on the page. There were a few years in there where I wasn't sure that I would be able to make a career out of this. And I consider myself very lucky, to be able to be a full-time writer now, because it's so much fun.
So do you see yourself going back to YA contemporary, or do you think you're just going to stick with fantasy?
So for right now, I'm going to stick with fantasy, but I never say never. I love writing contemporary. I have a really special place in my heart for contemporary novels. I have one that's half written sitting on my hard drive right now. So you never know. And that one is very cute. It's like about a boy who's into theater and a girl who's into softball. And it was a lot of fun to start writing.
Oh
I'll tell you right now, I would definitely read that.
We'd all read it.
This is not actually my first book by you. This is actually something I wanted to tell you. So the day that I booked the show YA that I'm on, I celebrated and I was like, Mom, I want to go to the bookstore because I'm so happy and I want to go to the bookstore because I was just like, oh, that was all I wanted. And so I was looking in the young adult section and I saw Call It What You Want. And so I was like, Mom, can I get this? And she's like, yes, you got the role, you can get the book. And I devoured it in like a day. And then I bought a copy myself and I have it on my bookshelf. And that book, I think, will always like stay with me because I loved Call It What You Want so much. So when Kara talked about her next book, Letters to the Lost, she's like, you need to read it. So I picked it for this month's book club so I could read it, and I'm so glad I did. So thank you for being a really good writer because I got a lot of drama out of both books.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. I love your stories. I love them.
Yay, thank you. And I love it when people, because Call It What You Want came out the same year as A Curse So Dark and Lonely. And I feel like it got a little overshadowed by A Curse So Dark and Lonely. But I love Rob and Megan, and I love their whole story and everything that they're going through. I really love writing about my poor tormented teenagers.
Oh, that story made me cry. Both of them.
Oh, yay. It made me cry too.
That story was sad, but also like Megan and Rob, that was
a roller coaster.
That was a roller coaster. So thank you for giving me a lot of emotions and a lot of tears. Happy tears and sad tears. So thank you for that.
Sure.
So what was the number one thing you wanted people to take away from Letters to the Lost?
So for that one, probably just one of the themes that I thought about a lot when I was writing the book was that you really can't judge somebody by a snapshot of their lives, and I think that would be the biggest thing, that, just what you think of somebody from a picture or from social media, is not the totality of their life. And it's not the totality of who they are as a person. I think we have gotten to a point where everybody is, so quick to judge someone else based on what they see or something that they said a year ago or a picture that they post. And that, that doesn't encapsulate anyone. And I think that would be the biggest thing that I would want people to take away from the book.
So I have a question for you. Was there any one book that you read that affected any of the other books you've written before? It could be this one, it could be Call What You Want, it could be A Curse So Dark and Lonely. What was a book that was wow, I'm inspired by this?
So here, I will tell you a crazy story. And I tell that anytime I do a school visit, I talk about this one book that had just had a profound impact on my life. So when I was 22 or 23, I was working in a bookstore, and I had started dating this boy who was also 23 or 24, very clean cut, normal, professional type guy. Met him while I was working at the bookstore. And one day he takes me out to dinner and he's like, I really need to tell you something about myself. And he said, other people haven't taken it well, but I really want to be honest. And I'm like, okay. And he says, so I need to make you aware that I spent a few years in jail or in prison. And I'm like, okay, well, he's pretty young. And again, clean cut, nice guy. And, and I'm thinking people make mistakes. Maybe he did something when he was 17 or 18. I'm a very, open-minded, I try to be a very caring, empathetic person. And I said, okay, so what did you do? Why did you spend time in jail? And I'm thinking he made some stupid mistake or, was driving drunk or something like that. He said, well, When I was a freshman in college, my girlfriend broke up with me and I really didn't take it well. So I tried to hire a hitman to kill her, and it turned out he was an FBI agent. Right. The expression on your faces is pretty much identical to my reaction to this story, sitting at dinner with this boy. And I was like, wow, that's a lot. And so, I said, I really need, to take time to think about this. So of course I got home and I called my mom and I'm like, like, what do I do? And she's like, what do you mean? What do? You break up with him? So I did. And as you can imagine, he did not take it in a mature way. And he, really kind of turned into a stalker. And it was very, like, now I can tell this story in a funny way. It was, almost 20 years ago. But at the time it was very frightening. He would show up at my apartment. He would ring my doorbell at 4 a.m. My manager at the bookstore, it was in a mall, and she would call me and she'd be like, you can't come in for your shift. He's sitting on the bench outside the bookstore. All this kind of stuff was happening. And I ultimately had to, go to the police and get a restraining order, but it was awful. And the way this comes back to a book is I remember that there's one day I was in the bookstore and I was talking to my manager about everything I was going through. And I was like, this is really terrifying. And this woman overhears me and she walks up to me and she like puts this book in my hands and she said, you need to read this book. It will change your life. And this book was called The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. And it was amazing. And what's fascinating about it is a book. Every chapter is about like a situation that someone has found themselves in where they didn't listen to their instincts and how they could have reacted differently. And it's such a powerful book, and it's really interesting. Like it's an interesting book to read. I'm not a big nonfiction person. It's really interesting to read. And the whole book is about like how we as people, really we as women, are kind of trained as we grow up to, kind of be nice and to turn our instincts off and be like, oh no, it's okay. And the whole book is about just the different ways that people can manipulate each other and the ways we turn off our instincts. And that book, I think, has really affected me as a woman, as a mother, and as a writer, because I think about scenes from that book all the time, especially as I'm writing characters and like how they're interacting with each other. That was a really long story, answered your question.
You're good. That was so fascinating. I felt like you're like describing like a book to me. Like that feels like that could be like a book too, but that's probably too traumatizing to write about. I feel like
it was so weird. Like I think back, I'm like, did that really happen? And I remember like one morning I had a friend spend the night and like, we came out and I was like, just look around, see if you see his car. And she didn't see his car. And I remember us getting into the car and leaving. And as soon as we pulled out of my apartment parking lot, his car pulled right up behind me. Like he rode my bumper for 25 miles. Oh, it was awful. Anyway, it was so creepy. It's just so awful.
You definitely have a lot of interesting life stories. I know. You could just write an entire book about just like your life stories. I would read that. Oh my God.
I want to read it now. You have to write that into something.
Put it in a book one day.
My final question for you is, what advice do you have for aspiring writers out there?
So probably the best advice that I can give aspiring writers is to read widely. Read as much as possible. Read books by people that don't look like you. Read books by people that don't think like you. Read books that you wouldn't normally pick up. Go read The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. No, and I think especially for young writers to, take classes and things that keep them curious. Not necessarily classes in how to be a good writer, but classes in how people think and how people interrelate and things that keep you asking questions. Because I think that is the basis of any book is, what if I did this? Or what if this happened? And as long as you stay curious and figure out how to write about it, that's the best path to being a writer.
That was really good. So thank you so much for spending time with us today.
This was so much fun. Thank you for inviting me.
I had so much fun. Thank you to Sophia for also reading this with us. Like we had
no problem.
this. Like I color coded a lot of different parts, and I was like, oh my god,
That's so cool.
about.
I know. I have a whole. I literally videoed them because I would like be like, oh my gosh, I'm at this page and this is happening. And I actually have a video when, you know, Juliet finds the pictures of her mom and I'm like, literally, I was so angry. And then all of a sudden I just started crying and I was like, why would she do this? It was a great journey.
Thank you all so much.
This book is one of my favorite books of all time. And if you guys have not read it yet, please go check out Letters to the Lost by Brigid. Also, check out her other books. They are amazing. We'll have a link in the description box. Thank you so much for coming on today and taking your time to discuss with us your amazing book.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
all. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.